Marking a year since protests brought down Ukraine's government, leaving a nation divided and setting Russia on a collision course with the West. In the midst of political and economic turmoil and ongoing fighting, can there be any real winners? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. It was a pivotal moment, with Ukraine at a crossroads, faced with the choice of turning west and embracing a political and free trade agreement with the European Union, or looking east and renewing trade ties with its old Soviet master, Russia. The decision by then President Viktor Yanukovych to freeze ties with Europe was to have profound repercussions, drawing thousands onto the streets in protest and drawing Russia, Europe and the US into a dangerous new diplomatic phase. A year on, and thousands of Ukrainians have been marking the anniversary of those first protests and remembering those killed during the political upheaval and subsequent conflict, a figure the United Nations puts at some 4,300.
The things which we had been dreaming of a year ago are becoming a reality. It's not happening as quickly as we'd wished. The freedom of speech, freedom of choice, freedom of protest have returned. From dictatorship, we've been transformed into a parliamentary presidential democracy. We have signed, ratified and finally started to execute the association agreement with the EU.
Well, let's recap on events of the past 12 months. Stemming from what many saw as a betrayal by President Viktor Yanukovych. A trade deal with Europe had seemed inevitable, but an 11th-hour decision to reject it was widely seen as bowing to pressure from Russian President Vladimir Putin. There was a swift reaction and violent confrontations in the capital, Kyiv. After months camped in Independence Square, protesters were cleared by riot police and special forces. 2 days after some of the worst violence, President Yanukovych fled the country for Russia. Away from the capital, pro-Russian gunmen began taking over key buildings and bases in the Crimean Peninsula. A referendum on independence from Ukraine was held, and Russia then annexed the peninsula. In April, pro-Russian protesters began storming buildings across eastern Ukraine. Kyiv had accused Moscow of supporting separatist rebels. And fighting is still going on despite a ceasefire signed in September. Well, plenty to discuss with our guests for this Inside Story. In Kyiv, we have Mikhailo Winitsky, Associate Professor, Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Joining us from Moscow is Pavel Felgenhauer, a foreign policy and political analyst. And completing our lineup in Oxford is James Scher, Associate Fellow for the Russian and Eurasia Program at Chatham House. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Mikhailo Winitsky. A tumultuous year. At this time, one remembers the many people who died, but it's also perhaps a time to look at what achievements have been made. What do you think the achievements have been?
Well, first of all, I think that one of the most important achievements is that Ukrainians got rid of a tyrant and have shown to the world that, quite frankly, being hostage to the decisions of one man is not something that's acceptable in a modern state. Just to comment a little bit on your report, however, I think it's important to understand that there's several aspects to things that have happened over the last year. One is an internal matter, which is what happened behind me on the Maidan and started a year ago. And completed 3 months later after a lot of freezing and a lot of protest and, as you said, some violence. And then quite another thing is the aggression that has come from Moscow and the annexation of Crimea and, quite frankly, the ongoing war in the east. These really are two separate issues that unfortunately have become conflated in the discourse and in the narrative that has been popularized, certainly worldwide. I think it's important to understand that these are two different things. As far as the internal revolution is concerned, of course there are people that would have liked to have seen changes happen much faster, and I think that changes will now happen a lot faster now that we've gone through 2 election cycles and we've had a change of elites. But reality is that there's a long way to go, and I think that that's one of the things that the people on the streets really recognize. We have a long way to go in fighting corruption. We have a long way to go in fighting in building new institutions, in building a new democratic state that actually will fulfill the promise of a European Ukraine.
Well, Pavel Felgenhauer, your view, has achievements been made?
Well, for Moscow, of course, this is basically the mass opinion in Moscow, that this is a geopolitical conspiracy against Russia, that what is called in Ukraine the Revolution of Dignity is an American financed and organized plot to take over Ukraine and use it as a base of operations in the future against Russia. So the Russian opinion that was expressed in the official media during this anniversary was practically all very, very negative. That this was a destructive process and that it's bad for Russia, it's bad for Ukraine, it's bad for everyone, it leads to disaster.
James, sure. I want to pick up on something that Mykhailo Winitsky mentioned right at the beginning, separating out the processes, the process of an internal democratization and the process of a Russian involvement in the Ukraine as a whole. You think that's a valid point to separate out?
Oh, yes, and it can be endlessly elaborated. What I think needs to be borne in mind is that when the insurrection started in the East, and it has been an insurrection from the beginning, which has been orchestrated, guided, and financed by the Kremlin, the expectation in Moscow was that it would launch a general uprising in the East, and nothing of the kind has happened. What has been clearly displayed is that the vast majority of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, whatever their ethnicity, have been on the side of the Ukrainian state, and as a result today, the pro-Kremlin forces control only 40% of Luhansk Oblast and a smaller proportion of Donetsk Oblast.
Pavel Felgenhauer, what has just been said there, I mean, many critics of President Putin have insisted that developments, positive developments shown by Ukraine, particularly with regard to a democratization of the society, in themselves pose a threat to Russia. Your view of that position?
Oh, yes, and that has been officially stated just this week. President Vladimir Putin, speaking at the meeting of the Russian National Security Council about extremism, was talking about the threat of the so-called coward revolutions, that these revolutions, and he was actually implying first and foremost Ukraine, are financed from abroad, that they are designed to destroy established governments and undermine states. So yes, of course, this is also seen as a threat. It's seen as a combined threat coming from revolutionary Ukraine and coming from its American backers. So it's geopolitical and it's internal, and that the Russian elite and the Russian people should unite against such a outside threat.
Mykhailo Winitsky, I just want to get back to some of those. Sorry, you wanted to say follow on to something? Carry on.
I just wanted to follow on to something that Pavel said, and I'm being a little bit flippant. If it were the Americans that were financing this whole thing, I'm really kind of disappointed that I wasn't able to make any money on it. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous to talk about an internal revolution that has led to 100 deaths and now 4,000 deaths in an aggression, a direct aggression from Vladimir Putin and the Russian forces in Ukraine. Talk about that being somehow financed by the United States. We wish, in fact, in Ukraine that there were a little bit more financing coming from the U.S. I'll just remind the viewers that President Poroshenko did ask in his speech to Congress. He did ask for lethal aid, and the statement was very clear: you don't win a war with blankets. Unfortunately, the United States nor any other NATO country has been particularly, well, let's put it this way. The pockets haven't exactly been open with respect to helping Ukrainians with their fight against overt aggression. By the way, Putin has actually admitted to the fact that there are Russian troops on the ground in Crimea, and has come very close to admitting to the fact that there are Russian troops on the ground in eastern Donetsk as well.
Well, I do want to pick up on that point that you made about U.S. involvement. And let's just pause here. U.S. Vice President Joe Biden has been in Ukraine as a measure of how seriously Washington says it is taking the crisis. Speaking alongside President Petro Poroshenko, he warned that Russian military intervention in Ukraine was unacceptable.
the international community condemning Russian actions, expanding security assistance to Ukraine, imposing greater and greater cost on Russia for its illegal actions, and refusing to accept the so-called elections held by separatists on November the 2nd. They were Kremlin-orchestrated farce. And let me say as clearly and categorically as I can, America does not and will not recognize Russian occupation and attempted annexation of the Crimea. We do not, will not, and insist others do not accept this illegal annexation.
Well, James Scher, talking tough there, the Vice President, but once again, to return to a previous point, what exactly has the US done? They have now pledged what is called non-lethal weaponry, for example, a couple of Humvees, various military supplies, including some light radar systems. However, it does appear falling short of the hopes of many Ukrainians. Do you think that there is a degree of failure on the part of the US and its Western allies in terms of helping Ukraine through this past year of tumult?
I think the biggest failing of the West has been a failure to read Russia correctly, to understand the risks that the Kremlin is willing to take, the pain that it is willing to absorb, the cynicism of its methods and approach, and there are still today too many people who think it is possible to come to some kind of amicable settlement that will be in the mutual interests of Russia, Ukraine itself, and its Western partners. But that balance is changing. The reluctance to send arms stems largely from a fear that it will provoke the Kremlin, that is somewhat deterred for the moment, into far more extreme and reckless acts. Pavel Felgenauer is absolutely right to say that from the time of the Yugoslav wars, the Kremlin has perceived regime change, military intervention, and the maintenance of hegemony as the essence of U.S. policy, and they view the ultimate goal of this as the isolation and the destabilization and the weakening of Russia itself. That is their perception, whatever we might think of it.
Well, Pavel Felgenauer, that particular point, that is the perception that Russia, for example, the US not giving live weaponry because it is concerned about an escalation. Is that the kind of response that there would be from Russia, firstly? And secondly, the other important point that was made there is that the US and the West have fundamentally misunderstood how strongly Russia would react to the events of a year ago.
Oh, yes, there's a lot of real misunderstanding and strategic misunderstanding in threat assessment and understanding the Russian threat assessment. Luckily, this week, there has been much more clarity. Russian top statesmen have made very important statements about Russian policy. The Kremlin press secretary, Mr. Peskov, said that Russia needs an ironclad 100% guarantee, a written guarantee, that Ukraine will never join NATO. And this was backed up also by the Russian foreign minister. And I believe that's indeed the main strategic Russian objective in the whole Ukrainian crisis. Russia does not want Ukraine to shift west, to become a member of European transatlantic security, economic, political integration systems. And we would do what it takes to prevent that. And right now we are doing what it takes to prevent that. For Russia, it's utmost important to keep Ukraine part part of the Russian sphere of influence, part of the kind of outside defense perimeter of Russia. And of course, this is some kind of agreement that will legally preclude Ukraine becoming a NATO member ever. Is hardware paper that anyone can give Russia. And that means that finding a amicable solution to this crisis is indeed very hard.
Well, I will come to you in a moment, Mikhailo Winitsky, but I just want to follow up something with James Scher about that phrase, amicable agreement. Clearly, diplomacy has failed. Clearly, there does not appear to be any area in which the West can reach some kind of agreement with Russia, removing the degree of victimhood that has been cast on Ukraine in all of this. Your view?
I think that to underscore the point, what we are looking at the moment are two fundamentally incompatible views of reality. The NATO issue is, in reality, a red herring. This crisis started over an agreement between Ukraine and the EU. At the time, a government was in power that had put into law a non-bloc policy that blocks Ukraine from joining NATO. And for Russia, joining the EU is equivalent to joining Russia. What Putin, I think, now understands he has probably lost any possibility of controlling or subordinating Ukraine, but what he is determined to do is wreck it. And in that enterprise, so far, he is doing very well. And he sees himself as being in a far stronger position than he's perceived in the West, and that is one reason why diplomacy is not going to produce the results we expect.
Mikhailo Winitsky, I saw you nodding in agreement with what James Scher there said, but I just want to move quickly to the internal aspect of what has happened over the past year. Corruption, critics say, is still rife within Ukrainian society. Economically, it is not out of the depressions to which it has sunk. These are issues that Ukrainians themselves do have power to deal with, do they not? Have they been doing enough?
The short answer to your question is, of course, they haven't been doing enough. And of course, there's always an opposition movement that would say that we could have done more. But the reality is that one of the reasons for the economic slump that everybody recognizes is the fact that we've had certain portions of the country sort of lopped off, and we entered into a conflict, a military conflict, with the second or the third largest military power in the world, basically without an army. So, quite frankly, over the last 6 to 8 months, what the Ukrainians have done in terms of military activity has actually been quite commendable and really quite amazing. I do want to respond, however, to some of the things that were said with respect to NATO. It's important to understand that everything that Putin is doing at the moment in Ukraine is really kind of backfiring on him, because yesterday, for example, we had for the first time a poll that was released of a national representative poll of Ukrainians, and for the first time ever in Ukraine's history, the majority of Ukrainians want to join NATO. This is a direct reaction to Russian policy in Ukraine. With respect to the internal stuff, look, of course, a year has gone by. I do want to also say one thing about Mr. Biden's visit yesterday. It actually turned out to be a sort of a non-news thing. Ukrainians are very much focused on changing their country internally. Mr. Biden's speech was very well received, but at the same time, we need to understand that it's a little bit of too little, too late. We've already had 4,000 deaths. Most people in Ukraine are not asking if there's going to be a continued invasion by Russia of Ukrainian territory, but rather when. It's actually a bit of a foregone conclusion. So Ukrainians are very much looking sort of internally at themselves, trying to build a new country, doing a lot of things in new ways. I think there's a lot of stabbing in the dark that's happening. A lot of things we're growing up as a country very quickly, and we're being forced to grow up as a country very quickly. It's a very hard slog to build new institutions in a country that's been completely raided and destroyed by a previous regime. But you know what? At the end of the day, it's really quite amazing what can be done in the span of 6 to 8 months, particularly when you're under attack from a lot of different sides.
Pavel Felgenhauer, the comment that was made there about President Putin not having realized the extent to which his actions could have created the opposite effect that he intended. That poll there that Mikhailo Winitsky mentioned, that the number of Ukrainians wanting to join NATO has in fact increased because of Russian action. Your view of that statement?
Well, I'm afraid the Kremlin is getting, and has been getting before, a lot of bad advice of how to deal with Ukraine. And so the results are indeed not good at all. That's actually understood here in Moscow, but there's still a hope expressed that comes winter is coming, it's going to be cold, there's going to be economic, financial meltdown in Ukraine, and then maybe the Ukrainian public will have second thoughts, that they'll understand that their future lies with Russia. There's a belief that Ukrainians have been brainwashed, but these are all just simply kind of excuses. Because Putin, of course, never says that he does anything wrong. He never admits to doing anything wrong. But there are voices in Moscow who say that we have lost Ukraine and that our policies there are a total disaster. And of course, Russia right now, as a result of sanctions, is also plunging into stagflation. So it's bad from all fronts. But that does not mean that the Kremlin will actually change its course right in the foreseeable future.
James Scher, you mentioned a little bit earlier that the West misunderstood President Putin. Is there the possibility that President Putin has misunderstood the resilience and the will to resist of the Ukrainian people?
I think when Angela Merkel used all of her influence to get the EU to adopt level 3 sanctions, that was totally unexpected in Russia. It was a game changer. But let's look at the other side of the coin. Mike, you mentioned the internal factor. What we inadequately call reform in Ukraine is now a matter of national survival. And yet, if you look at all of the negotiations and activity that has and hasn't been taking place since the parliamentary elections that produced a robustly pro-reform, pro-radical reform majority, you can be forgiven for forming the impression that reform is still a secondary priority for those in power, and that it is secondary to maintaining political and economic privileges. This country is within weeks of default. And the only party that can benefit from this scenario is Vladimir Putin. For that reason, I am absolutely convinced that despite President Biden's warm public words of support, the private discussions in Kyiv were very hard, and they're going to become harder.
Mikhailo Winitsky, your view of that, the correlation of reform with assistance?
Look, there's a lot of people here that are starting to become quite impatient with the fact that reform is not happening fast enough. We have a currency that has basically lost, 100% of its value, or it's gone down to 50% of where it was a year ago, or actually over 9 months. Now, we can blame that, of course, on Russian aggression, and many still do. But at the end of the day, there is a host of internal problems that need to be addressed, and they need to be addressed very, very quickly. I will say that we are anxiously awaiting and hoping for some external help with that, because of course Ukraine would like and is kind of expecting some help from its Western allies, specifically from the European Union and from North America, something to the gist of a sort of a renewed Marshall Plan or something like that. The reality is that we live again in a divided world. Ukraine, like Germany during the Cold War, is kind of a frontier country and, quite frankly, needs quite a bit of help. At the same time, people recognize that it is up to Ukrainians themselves, first and foremost, to change their country and to build the institutions. I'm very much optimistic because we've had an election that has changed the elite less than a month ago, but at the same time, a month in this part of the world can feel like an eternity, and things need to happen very, very quickly now before the new year.
Well, on that particular note, my thanks to our guests, Mikhailo Winitsky, Pavel Felgenhauer, and James Scher. And we're always interested to hear what you think. You can post your comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. or contact us on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.